Welcome, fellow Stardust. Thank you for joining me for another episode of True Crime and Nails. Today's episode will feature serial killer Danny Rolling, the inspiration behind the film franchise Scream.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
What did you say?
Screenwriter Kevin Williamson was an aspiring writer in the 90s and was struggling to pay the bills. He knew he wanted to fill a void in teen horror, he just didn't know in what way yet, until he saw a report on TV about Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper.
Then you step one day and say, okay, Dan, you're going to be a serial killer. No, Lucifer, he got eggs at me for a long time, knocking on the door to my mind.
Feeling inspired by this man's horrific acts of violence, Kevin went right to work and wrote the script for Scream in just a few days. As gruesome and terrifying as Scream can get sometimes, the true story behind the inspiration is a much more disturbing and violent one. The level of violence compares to the murders of Keith Jesperson, Richard Ramirez, and Ted Bundy. So buckle up. Viewer discretion is advised. Danny Rolling was born in 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana. His mother, Claudia, was only 19 years old, and his father, James Rolling, was a police officer and decorated Korean War vet. Danny's father suffered from PTSD, and it was speculated that he also had an inherent mental illness. Despite James never wanting kids, Claudia got pregnant 2 weeks after they got married. James was physically and mentally abusive to both Danny and his wife, which worsened when Claudia gave birth to Danny's brother, Kevin, the very next year in 1955. Claudia recalls one of the first times James physically harmed Danny. He was just under a year old and was beaten for crawling funny. According to Claudia, the abuse was mostly mental, but he would get physical with him 2 to 3 times a week. She tried leaving James multiple times, but they would always end up back together. Once when she left, she suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be hospitalized. That same year, Danny was ill often and missed a lot of school, so he was held back in the 3rd grade. This, of course, upset his father, and he was beaten because of it. Danny's school counselor said he was, quote, suffering from an inferiority complex with aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control. They encouraged his mother to seek help, but Danny never got the help he desperately needed. At around 11 years old, Danny took an interest in art and music. It was his escape from his tormented reality. During his adolescent years, Claudia was committed to a psychiatric hospital after slitting her wrists. Some sources say that she actually claims that James had forced her to cut her own wrists with razors. With his mother in the hospital and being left alone with his father and brother, Danny turned to drugs and alcohol. He began to get into trouble for various crimes like stealing and peeping. At 14, he was caught by his neighbors looking into their daughter's window. And of course, his father gave him a good beating. But Danny didn't want to be a bad person, so he went to church regularly and tried his best to keep a job, but it wasn't easy. One of Danny's happiest memories was when he was 15 and received a guitar as a gift. He would go on to learn how to play very well and proved he had talent that would soon go to waste. He said it's about this time he developed multiple personalities to help him cope with his reality, a reality of abuse, fear, and mental illness. In 1973, when he was 18, he tried to enlist in the Navy but was unsuccessful, so he instead enlisted in the Air Force. It's unclear whether he was kicked out or left on his own, but that same year, he left the military, likely because of his drug use, and went to live with his grandfather. For a while, it seemed as though Danny finally found his footing in life. He was going to church regularly where he met his ex-wife, Mather Halco, and the two of them had a daughter. However, his mental health issues weren't just going to go away. After 4 years of marriage, at the age of 23, Danny reverted to his old ways and threatened to kill Mather. Taking no chances, she quickly left and never saw him again until he was on trial for murder.
Did you ever hear anything about anybody named Gemini or Enad or any other name given to a spirit?
No, I didn't. The reason I left, decided to leave, was that he threatened my life with a shotgun.
Well, that hurt. Well, I never got over that. Ended up in prison not too long after that.
After his wife left him, he began to travel all through the South and went back to his old ways of armed robberies and other crimes. He also began raping women who looked a lot like his wife. Beginning in 1979 and throughout the 80s, unable to keep a job, Danny was in and out of jail in Alabama and Mississippi. In November of 1989, after being fired from yet another job in Shreveport, he decided to take his anger out on a family of 3. He spotted Julie Grissom and followed her home, where he brutally murdered her, her father John, and her nephew Sean. They were 24, 55, and 8 years old and had all been stabbed to death. Julie had been stabbed several times in the back. Authorities believe John and Sean weren't the target, but were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. When they found Julie's body, they noticed that she had bite marks and that she had been cleaned. Danny did this likely to wash away any evidence, but some believe that since taking a photo was too high of a risk, he instead took a mental photo and wanted that image to be a clean and pristine one. After cleaning her body, he posed it in a sexual way on the bed with her legs open. A few months later, in May of 1990, he had his last argument with his father and shot him in the head and stomach. Thinking that he killed him, Danny fled to Kansas and made his way to Florida and eventually ended up in Gainesville, Florida, a college town. However, his father didn't die, but he did lose an eye and an ear. Shortly after arriving in Gainesville, Danny decided he wanted a new knife, and so on July 18th, he headed to a pawn shop where he purchased a Marine soldier knife. This would end up being the murder weapon for the rest of his victims. Experts say that serial killers who choose a knife as their weapon do so because they want to get up close and personal with their victims and feel their fear. Like Danny, many of them get aroused by sensing and feeling that pain and sense of helplessness. The next month, on August 18th, Danny checked into the University Inn. A few days later, on Thursday, August 23rd, he went to Walmart and bought a tent and began to search for a place to set up camp, likely in preparation for his future killings. I imagine he probably figured it wouldn't be smart to go on a killing spree while staying at a hotel, and he was probably low on funds. He settled on a wooded area behind the University of Florida. Investigators believe he chose this location because he was jealous of these young college students who had opportunity at their fingertips, something he never had and never would. And the timing was just right. The fall semester was about to begin and the town was buzzing. The college kids were celebrating and were ready to take on the new year. At this point, Danny had broken into a home and stole identity papers and changed his name to Michael Kennedy Jr. After setting up his new home, the very next day, he went out for his next kill. On Friday, August 24th, he broke into the apartment of incoming University of Florida freshmen Christina Powell and Sonia Larson, both 17. The two met over the summer break and had decided to room together. Sonia was first. He taped her mouth shut so her screams couldn't be heard by Christina and stabbed her repeatedly. He then headed back downstairs where Christina was sleeping. He also taped her mouth shut, bound her hands behind her back with tape, and raped her before stabbing her 5 times in the back. Again, he posed their bodies in sexual positions, and this time, he took Sonia's nipples as souvenirs, as well as the tape he used to bind them so as not to leave any DNA evidence. The girls weren't found until 2 days later, on Sunday, August 26th, when Christina's parents called her apartment manager looking for her. They had come into town for a visit. Christina was expecting them, but they hadn't gotten a hold of her all day. Her parents explained that Sonia was also supposed to be in touch with her parents, but they hadn't heard from her either. The manager of the apartment complex decided to call the police before letting the parents into the girls' apartment to avoid any liability and to be cautious overall. Alachua County Officer Ray Barber showed up and called for backup after hearing the parents' story and seeing Christina's car unmoved in the parking lot. When the group entered the apartment after backup arrived, the maintenance guy ran out before the parents even made it inside. His reaction confirmed their deepest fears. Merely hours after discovering Christina and Sonia's bodies, on the 27th, Officer Ray Barber's wife, Gail Barber, who also worked for the sheriff's office as a dispatcher, asked her husband to check on Krista Hoyt. Krista was 30 minutes late for her midnight shift, and Gail knew Krista enough to know it wasn't like her to not call. She was an incoming freshman at Santa Fe Community College, and Gail had just hoped Krista had gotten caught up with friends. However, when Ray Barber got to Krista's home, he found another bloody crime scene. This one was a bit more gruesome. This time, Danny had severed Krista's head off and placed it on her bookshelf, facing her yet again, posed body propped on the bed. Like Sonia, he had cut off her nipples, but this time he left them next to her corpse. She had also been beaten, raped, and stabbed. Afterwards, he took a shower and took the tape he used to bind her up with, again leaving tape residue on her mouth and wrists as he did before. News of the murders of Christina and Sonia brought fear to the college town, and students were frightened and saddened by the incident. But after finding out the next morning another student from a different school had also been killed, sent everyone into a panic. People didn't walk around alone anymore, day or night. Large groups of friends decided to stay together in tiny apartments and take turns sleeping. Many parents had their children come home temporarily, and some parents even pulled their kids out completely, transferring them to new schools altogether. But little did they know that the killer had already claimed his next two victims just hours after taking Krista's life, but their bodies hadn't been found yet. It wasn't until August 28th when Gainesville learned of the deaths of Manuel Taboada and Tracy Paulus. They had been friends since high school and were both 23 years old. He was an aspiring architect and she was a political science graduate. They had just moved in with each other. Up until this point, all of the victims had been petite, white, and brunette, but after the murder of Manny, it seemed as though anyone was fair game, which shook everyone. Manny tried to overpower Danny, and he must have put up a good fight, because Danny ended up stabbing him 31 times, likely in a fit of rage. He then found Tracy, who he taped, bound, and raped. After stabbing her 3 times in the back, he raped her again as her body laid there lifeless. He then cleaned and posed her, but left Manny's body as it was after stabbing him.
Then the killing stops, but the fear is just beginning.
Very nervous. It's scared. The thing is, in my apartment we have the 4 girls. All 4 of us are brown hair, petite girls. All 4 of us have moved out of our apartment and are living with my roommate's parents in Ocala.
Authorities were eager to find the person responsible for the murders that had occurred in the last 4 days. They thought they had their killer when they arrested UF student Edward Humphrey, who lived in the same complex as Manny and Tracy. He was known to have erratic behavior and walk around campus wearing camo and carrying long knives. He had large scars all over his face from 2 car accidents, so he looked the part, and he was enough to satisfy the public. Ed would later admit to being off of his medication, lithium, for his manic depression during the times of the murders, which would hurt his defense. Even though they had no evidence to link him to the murders yet, he was arrested for assaulting his grandmother, and his bail was set at $1 million. However, his grandmother testified that he hadn't hit her, but it fell on deaf ears. Because DNA profiling was still relatively new, it took a while before authorities finally realized that he wasn't responsible for the murders of the 5 Gainesville students. Sometime after killing Manny and Tracy, Danny robbed a bank at gunpoint, but the teller managed to stick a dye can in the money bag, making the money useless. Afterwards, someone spotted Danny walking into the woods after hearing the news of Chris's death and reported it to a tip line. When the police found the campsite, they found the money bag along with other items like a tape player with a cassette, the screwdriver Danny used to break into his victim's home, and the gun he used for the robbery. Nothing they found made them think that this was the Gainesville Ripper, and didn't think much of the evidence, so they stuffed it away in a locker to be forgotten. On September 8th, Danny attempted to rob again, a Winn-Dixie grocery store in Ocala, Florida, about 40 miles from Gainesville. He fled the scene and led the cops on a high-speed chase that ended with him crashing the getaway car, taking off on foot, and eventually getting arrested. While he wouldn't become a suspect for the Gainesville murders for several months, he would end up facing a life sentence for all the armed robberies he had committed all throughout the South. But finally, in November, Cindy Jurasich, an old friend of Danny's, had a hunch that he could have been involved in the Shreveport and Gainesville murders. She told investigators that after Julie Grissom and her family were murdered, that Danny came to her house and visited with her husband. When he left, her husband said he was done with him after Danny told him that he likes to stick knives into people. She at first dismissed what her husband said, but after the murders occurred in Gainesville, her gut told her it had to be Danny. After getting this tip, and realizing the murders in Shreveport were very similar to the murders in Gainesville, investigators took DNA from Danny's extracted tooth and were able to link him to the murders. However, it wouldn't be until September 18, 1991, when Edward Humphrey is released without a public apology. Continuing to connect the dots, officers theorized that the person who murdered Krista and robbed the bank the same day could have been the same person. So they go back to the evidence that was found at the campsite months ago. They found that the screwdriver matched the markings on the doors that he had broken into. They also found one of the victim's pubic hairs in his sleeping bag and a spatter of blood on the inside of his pant leg, which matched the DNA of one of the victims. When they first found the cassette player with the tape, they didn't think to play it, but this time around they did, and what was on it was chilling. The tape was 58 minutes of 11 songs about heartbreak and outlaws, audio diaries, and apologies to his mother, brother, and father. The lyrics were haunting and dark and alluded to his past and future murders. Some of the lyrics are, "Little girls are not all sugar and spice. You're a killer, a drifter gone insane. You're a rebel no one can tame." To his father, he said, quote, "You just pushed me away at a young age, Pop. I wanted to make you proud of me. I let you down. I'm sorry for that. Well, I'm gonna sign off for a little bit. I got something I gotta do. I love ya. Bye." He started recording this tape while he was in Sarasota, after going on the run after attempting to kill his father, who he thought he had killed. He finished the tape while in Gainesville, just hours before he killed his first two victims. Prosecutor Rod Smith played the tapes for the jury in court to convince the audience that the murders were premeditated, even if Danny was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. When Danny was first arrested for the armed robberies, he was completely cooperative with authorities. But on January 1st, 1991, they became witnesses to the other side of Danny. He had violent outbursts and would talk about his murders to his fellow prisoners. Sometimes he'd speak about them remorsefully, other times he would brag about it. He was finally charged for the murders in 1992 and eventually confessed in 1993, right before his murder trial began, to the surprise of everyone. Danny didn't speak one word during his 3-hour confession, but instead used fellow inmate Bobby Lewis, the only man who has escaped Florida's death row. Danny somehow thought getting close to him would help him find a way out, even if not by physically escaping himself. But Danny was enjoying the limelight. He stated numerous times that he looked up to Ted Bundy and wanted to be a superstar like him. While in prison awaiting trial, Danny started a relationship and got engaged to journalist Sandra London. She helped him write his book, The Making of a Serial Killer. Naturally, seeing this book in local bookstores was hard for the loved ones of the victims. Supposedly, the book's purpose was to help deter future killers from becoming murderers. Some believe it only encouraged them. During the trial, his mother testified that he had had a rough childhood growing up with his abusive father.
How frequently would the boys, particularly Danny, receive a whipping?
Well, if it was a verbal whipping, it was every day.
How about physical?
Often, probably about twice a week, something like that.
His ex-girlfriend from 1988, Lillian Bunny Mills, a country singer and music producer, also testified in his favor. She said he would have angry outbursts and suggested that he go to therapy, but he would refuse because he feared that what he said would get back to his father. His ex-wife, Omather Halco, did not help his defense. She told the courtroom that while she was with him, she never saw or heard of any abuse from his father. When psychiatrists addressed the jury about Danny's mental illness, they did confirm that he had antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and paraphilia, which is when someone is sexually aroused to atypical objects, fantasies, behaviors, situations, or individuals. In Danny's case, he was aroused by one's fear of death. He still was able to understand the severity of his crimes and knew that they were wrong. Psychiatrists ruled out DID, multiple personality disorder, and dismissed his claims of his alter ego, Gemini, being responsible for his actions. It only took a couple of hours for the jury to find him guilty of first-degree murder on all 5 counts. He would later confess to the murder of the Grissom family, but was never charged. The next month, on April 20th, 1994, he was sentenced to death. After filing his last appeal and being denied for the last time, he was executed on October 25th, 2006, by lethal injection. His last meal was lobster tail with butter, butterfly shrimp with cocktail sauce, a baked potato with sour cream and butter, strawberry cheesecake, and a sweet tea. Right before his death, he sang a hymn to the 47 witnesses in the room, a group filled with the loved ones of his victims.
I regret with all my heart what my hand has done, for I have taken what I cannot return. If only I could bend back the hands on that ageless clock and change the past. Ah, but alas, I am not the keeper of time, only a small part of history and the legacy of mankind's fall from grace. I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Thank you for joining me today, fellow Stardust. I appreciate you being here with me. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Rules say I have to give Mr. Rawling an opportunity to have a say. You have anything you want to say, Mr. Rawling?
Well, sir. If it please the court, could I address the court?
Sure. Say whatever you want to say.
Thank you. And I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you, but it was hard to say. I couldn't touch you. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together.
Excuse me, Mr. Rawling.
Down the path you choose to follow.
Mr. Rawling.
So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together. What were my words? All my tears run together, baby, just like rain.